So the documentary hypothesis consists of 4 different sources, J and E and D and P, but it does allow for other sources. For example, most of Exodus 21 through 23, they would ascribe to a Canaanite law code, which they call the Book of the Covenant, and though that was incorporated into the JEP narratives. So the summary then is that, between 950 and 850 BC, you have the Yahweh source being written. And then between 850 and 750, you have the Elohist source. But then redactor JE combined those two in the mid-700s. But then Deuteronomy was written around 621 BC. And that came to be combined by redactor redactor D into JE and JED. But then the priestly sources were written between 550 and 400, and then the redactor P, perhaps Ezra, combined it into JEDP, the Pentateuch as we now have it. Now, why does any of this matter? Well, this hypothesis has been very influential in doing some things which I would consider bad things. One, it furthered the rationalism of scholars. Those who hold to this view are going to say that the Pentateuch is self-contradictory, that its claims of authorship, especially ascribing the laws to Moses, are untrue at points. And when this hypothesis came to be widely accepted, it led to the expulsion of conservative scholars from the academy. Those who questioned the documentary hypothesis ended up not being hired at universities and not being hired at seminaries that had been influenced by this hypothesis. It changed the emphasis of exegesis so that finding sources and the emphasis on source criticism became much more prominent. And indeed, it led to a complete revision of the history of Israel that rejected the Bible's own account of the history of Israel and substituted it with it a history of Israel that assumes the validity of the documentary hypothesis. It's a hypothesis that undermines the authority of Scripture. The Bible is neither inerrant or historically accurate according to this theory. And it has undermined the faith of students to whom it has been presented. I had a cousin named Christine who went to university, and she came home and said, well, I learned that everything I learned in Sunday school was wrong, and that in Genesis there's 2 gods, Yahweh and Elohim. And after that, she abandoned the faith and became an atheist. It has also served to undermine the faith of pastors. Pastors who have been taught this theory have found their faith in Scripture and its authority greatly weakened as a result. So let me move on from the theory to the history of how it was developed. From Spinoza to Wellhausen. Wellhausen did not invent the documentary hypothesis. There were earlier theories that he built on that made his reconstruction of it sound plausible to scholars of his own generation. It begins with a Jewish philosopher by the name of Spinoza. Spinoza was a Jew, but he denied the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. And he argued, reasonably enough, that Moses surely could not have written the account of his own death in Deuteronomy chapter 34. And so he proposed that the Pentateuch through Kings was proposed by Ezra, a theory that Wellhausen picks up on. The next stage of the theory comes with a French physician by the name of Jean Astruc. He was a physician and a medieval scientist, and famous for things scientific, actually, if you look him up on Wikipedia. But he dabbled in biblical studies, and in 1753 he tried to explain why in the Bible, in Genesis, why some texts referred to God as Yahweh and some texts referred to God as Elohim. And he argued that Moses had two different written sources. One source preferred the name for God Yahweh. Others preferred to designate him as Elohim, which is translated God. And thus Astruc became the father of source criticism. He was the first to propose the theory of different sources in Pentateuch, although in most ways he would be very conservative. He attributed all the Pentateuch to Moses, but he assumed that Moses had pre-existing sources. But anyway, he gave the documentary hypothesis this basic criterion: divine names. Next comes a German scholar by the name of Eichhorn. He's the father of Old Testament criticism. He wrote a 3-volume massive work, Introduction to the Old Testament. And in that introduction to the Old Testament, you can see the dates, late 18th century, he accepted Astruc's hypothesis that there were two sources in Genesis, and he added the labels. He called the one source J for Yahweh, spelled with a J in German, and E for Elohim, the Elohis, Astruc's other source that preferred the name Elohim or God for the deity. And he went on to argue that there were J and E sources in the rest of the Pentateuch, though he rejected the Mosaic authorship of Scripture altogether and argued that the Pentateuch represented the national literature of Israel, but it was not Scripture inspired by God. That brings us to the next figure in this history, Alexander Gettys, again late 18th century primarily. He was a Scottish Catholic priest and Bible scholar, and he proposed what's called the Fragmentary hypothesis, that the Pentateuch was put together from many fragments at the time of Solomon. He argued that some of those fragments were as old as Moses, while others were as recent as Solomon. Moreover, he associated Joshua with the Pentateuch, the book of Joshua, to form what he called the Hexateuch. So that would be the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Now, Gettys was rebuked by the church for his rationalism, though he remained a Catholic until his death. The next major stage of the documentary hypothesis comes with a man by the name of De Witt, who wrote a dissertation in 1805. The thesis of his dissertation was that the book of the law, discovered in the temple in 2 Kings 22, was in fact the book of Deuteronomy. But that book of Deuteronomy is not really speeches of Moses, but rather is a pious fraud produced by Hilkiah the priest in order to promote Jerusalem and its priesthood as the place where worship was to be centralized. Otherwise, he affirmed the fragmentary hypothesis.